Okay, I'm here and I'm just going to start out kind of doing what I got to do to this drawing, and then as I see people start to join, I'm going to maybe make a couple announcements really quick. So I'm going to, like I said, be just kind of working a little bit on the values on this one. There were some things that at the end I realized I maybe wanted to touch up a tiny bit. But I did want to make like an announcement at the beginning of this that so I posted a couple of videos today, one of this portrait and one of the kind of second portrait over here on Patreon. I noticed when I was posting though that there was a couple of audio issues, especially with the second video. So right now I'm actually kind of re-editing and I'm going to repost copies of those videos that are a lot more, the sound is much more easy to hear and so on. So just so you know, that's happening, and I'm sorry that the first version of them is not as excellent as it should be. Also, for the sake of this this live stream, if you have a question, you can put it into the comments, and I'll get to it as soon as I see it. And I also have maybe a couple topics that I wanted to talk about as well. If someone could give me a confirmation that the sound is working all right, just so I know and I don't have to worry about that, it would be awesome. Just a thumbs up in the comments or anything like that would be great. Great, thank you. So looking at this one, there was just a couple of things for me, like in terms of like the values on this side and also a little bit some of the shapes in the cheek that I thought I could elaborate on a little bit more. But I also wanted to like kind of mention a little bit, you know, some of my inspiration for the quick sketch videos. It's something that I had actually started to talk about during last month's live stream. It's kind of been an idea that's been brewing with me for a while. Just because I think that so many times when we're learning about drawing and painting, and those of you that have like studied at ateliers can attest to this, so much of the, what's the word I'm looking for, like the outcome of the drawings we're working on is really related to time. And I remember even thinking as a student that in some ways, you know, if you put me in front of a subject long enough, right, with enough critiques from teachers, inevitably I would come up with something that looked the way it was supposed to. And this is not to say like that doing drawings that last a long time is like a bad thing. It's only to say that, you know, your ability to discover what you're looking for rather than already know what you're looking for is way more when you take that long time. The interesting thing about quick sketches is they kind of reveal where we're at from an understanding standpoint, right? If you understand the head like really well, you should be able to create a version of it very quickly that is at least sound in terms of like representing the kind of major planes and structures of the head. And so they're a really great way to just kind of check in on your own kind of understanding of the subject that you're working on, right? And I feel like there's a little bit of this, you know, practice of working fast and slow that actually can be a great kind of tool for a student to track their progress. And I know that a lot of you that are studying with me on my Patreon page and watching videos and things, that's a very real need that we have, is to actually evaluate and to be able to sort of self-evaluate. But like I said, sometimes those longer drawings, in a way, they kind of hide some inconsistencies in our thinking that otherwise could be revealed if we're doing a bit of a kind of faster drawing. So that's part of the reason that I wanted to get into them, is I think that certainly they're going to be a really great benefit for those of you that kind of engage in that idea. And I also thought here maybe it'd be interesting to mention as well, like a head like this, I've probably cumulatively spent maybe like 4 hours on, and I know that also for some of you, you know, even that is going to be somewhat of a long time. I was actually on the phone with a friend of mine, colleague. I studied with him at the academy, and we were just kind of chatting about the new project I was getting in on these. And I said, yeah, it's great. I'm going to get into these quick sketches, and I think it's really going to like be fresh and like kind of keep people vital. And I was telling him all these interesting reasons. And he said, well, how long do you take on them? And I said, oh, about like 4 hours or so, 3-4 hours. And he laughed, of course, because for a lot of people that's still not relatively quick. But I think that 3-4 hours for me is, I think, a pretty good time to invest. Also, it kind of tends to correspond with like model times. Like if you're working in a group from life, usually you get those models for maybe 3 hours or so. So that was my kind of purpose in behind kind of choosing that that time. So again, I'll just reiterate here, if anybody has a question or a thought, you can put it into the comments. If not, I have like plenty of questions and thoughts that certainly I want to express during this live stream. And also while I have all of you here. Don't forget, I did mention at the beginning, I'm going to be reposting a couple of videos because of some audio problems. So the videos are there today, but they're going to be in a little bit better shape by tonight. So that's what that is. So looking at like a section like the nose here, what I'm doing right now is actually just kind of clarifying a little bit some of the planes, which is to say, like, if there's a thing that you lose doing a quick sketch, it tends to be the technique that's necessary to kind of unify the planes that you're drawing. So if we think of like the side plane, top plane, and side plane, if I was looking at this as a drawing that I really wanted to elevate from a technique perspective, I'd really be looking for like where those holes and inconsistencies in the value that I was using were. Now, there's a kind of relationship to the way that we're actually clarifying the technique. That actually puts a higher demand on the actual accuracy of the drawing, which just for the sake of it, we'll say, like, I think this is a relatively accurate drawing. Truth is, if I were to push through it and really start to render out these forms really smoothly, what we would discover inevitably is some inconsistencies. And so, for me, I think it's important, that in these projects that I'm doing, but also that you guys are going to be doing, certainly this month, that you have an understanding of like what the criteria, right, for like accuracy in a quick sketch is going to be. Because it is necessarily going to be a little bit less than what it is in like a drawing that's going to take a lot longer. And all of the things like in these drawings are orchestrated with that in mind, right? I was just talking about the kind of unity of these planes. The more I work on unifying them, the more I work on that technique, the more I would maybe start to see that there was some tiny asymmetry or a misplaced edge that needed to be kind of moved around. So I want to be careful to try not to make this drawing something that it isn't, right? And this is maybe something that I would expect for students is not such a clear idea. I talk about this a little bit in I think either the second or the third video, might even be the fourth video for this kind of drawing series. But the idea that like a drawing has an end point that is something that kind of carries through to all the choices that you'll take. And by that I mean, like, I'm purposefully not refining these planes as much as I could, because I understand that the point of this drawing really is to search through the structure, rather than to kind of render out a portrait that should look very refined. And maybe that kind of sounds weird, because it sounds like we're saying, well, we can be less accurate. It's not exactly that. It's kind of that, but it's not exactly that. I guess what I mean to say is that I think it would be unrealistic to expect that degree of accuracy from a drawing that we're going to do as rapidly as we're doing these. And while that isn't like a kind of a free pass to just to make a a caricature-esque type drawing, I will happily sacrifice a little bit of accuracy for a little bit of expression, if that makes sense. So on to some of the questions that I got throughout the month. And I'm just going to read one out here that was in the comments section on Patreon. So Sheila is saying, this is her comment here. One of the most beautiful parts of this drawing is the flat tone which you render the eyeshadows, and I wondered how you knew to do that. At what level does one stop articulating detail? That's the first part of the question, which I'm going to pause there for a second and talk about that, because it's a subject that kind of I feel like deserves its own kind of moment, right? So at what point do you stop rendering detail? There's several things that kind of come to mind when I think about that. One of which is just the actual size of the tool that I'm using, which a 0.3 millimeter pencil seems like it's going to be super specific. And it's going to be able to kind of get us to any level of detail that we want. But that in combination with two other things, time and the paper that you're using, is going to have a kind of a correlation to that. So what I mean to say is that my tools will only get me down to such a level of detail, right? And that I need to be careful not to surpass the level of detail that my tool can configure. So let's say that like the size of this eye, the size of the 0.3 millimeter pencil that I have, if I wanted to start drawing all of the eyelashes and all of the little striations in the iris, the size of the drawing, the size of my tool actually wouldn't allow me to do so with a technique that was consistent to the rest of the drawing. So in some ways I'm a little bit limited by that combination of factors. And that does make up a part of my decision making in terms of where to kind of stop rendering detail. Some of that inevitably becomes like habitual. Like if I'm drawing a head like this that is 2/3 life size, I'm going to understand intuitively that I'm not going to get down to a level of detail like that. Whereas if I was drawing, say, this head, but life size, right? If I was drawing this as large as the actual model could be, I might actually have the room from a technique and material standpoint to make details like that. So that's kind of one factor. Another factor really is like how you're kind of choosing to look at the model. And that of course doesn't so much have to do with your eyes, but it has to do with the kind of visual philosophy that you're using, right? So when I'm looking at a head, I'm thinking about it a lot in the way that like certain, say like 19th and 20th century American illustrators would have. Thinking here of like a Dean Cornwell or an N.C. Wyeth, where they were kind of taking into account that there are a series of like kind of consistent planes and structures within the head that we can expect to find, fairly universally, right? And this is the kind of basis or foundation for creating a design for the head that makes sense. Whereas, say, like an artist like Andrew Wyeth, for instance, might have not necessarily worked with any kind of like, template in that respect. I think he would have been probably very idiosyncratic and tried his best only to follow the model and not any preconceived notion. I should stress that I don't think either of these is correct. I just think that there are two different ways to kind of get to two different effects. And that for me, choosing this one that is related to having a little bit more of a kind of a template-based approach, at least in the beginning, leaves me in a place where I'm not going to be looking at details like that. I'm going to be looking at, what the three kind of major planes of the forehead are. I'm going to be looking at trying to render the zygomatic bone, not in the ultimately incredibly soft way that Andrew Wyeth might, but more in a way that you would find in, say, a Dean Cornwell painting, which would be a little bit more faceted, a little bit more simplified. Sheila is commenting here, but illustrators look into account the limitations, or took into account the limitations of print, and that affected how they designed. To be sure, there is some accuracy to that. I would state in response, though, that artists or illustrators like Dean Cornwell and certainly N.C. Wyeth were artists who were really making paintings rather than constraining themselves maybe to something that could be most easily accommodated in printmaking. You don't need to look further than the recent book that came out on Dean Cornwell, which if you don't have, I would highly recommend. It's not even particularly expensive. But the paintings in there are full of these rich impastos and layers that I can hardly imagine would have been reproduced with the means of printing that they had at the time. I think even now we probably struggle to reproduce paintings in a way that respects that kind of surface texture and kind of dynamic effect. So yeah, Sheila, I do take your point there, but also there's another side note to that as well. Yes, so I talked a little bit about when I stop articulating detail, and I want to move on to the rest of the comment that Sheila made on Patreon. So she says, now you had referred us in a previous post to Cyril Pierce's book Composition, and she puts then down a quote from Cyril Pierce that is, when gradation of surface quality is given to a decoration, the amount of range of gradation should be proportionate to the area. If a picture consists of two unequal spaces, the larger should be gradated more than the smaller area. Very small patches in a given composition could remain nearly flat, whilst larger areas might receive considerable gradation. Now, let's cross-reference that point in Cyril Pierce's composition book to the idea of shadow as atmosphere and light as form. So if we take a look at the light of this face, what we find is that more than 2/3 of the face probably is being hit by the light. And there are other passages, 1/3 perhaps, of shadow that are hidden from that light, and thus I'm choosing to keep the gradations mostly out of those areas and save my gradations for these lighter areas in order to draw attention to it. Now this is interesting for a couple of reasons, and actually I'm working on a video right now, as soon as I'm done with this live stream, that is actually about a backlit portrait. So a portrait that instead of being kind of lit from the front like this is actually lit from the other side of the head. So you have like a strong rim lighting and a very dark but kind of clear ambient lighting that's sort of showing the form of the face. What's interesting about that is that we need to invert the idea of shadow as atmosphere and light as form in order to fit Cyril Pierce's concept here, right? So he's saying that if you have one area of the face that it has tons of, or rather you have a large surface area of the face with light in it, that you should save your gradations for that rather than the shadows. Now if we flip that and said the larger area of the face is actually within shadow, and there is only bright light on, say, the rim of the form, that you would invert that thinking, that you would have the light be the atmosphere and the shadow be the form. So that's something I'm going to be working on, like I said, not for next month, but probably the month after that. But I'll have teasers out on Instagram and things. Just to explore this idea of kind of inverting the concept of shadow as atmosphere and light as form, which I think is kind of really exciting. Also because it kind of shows another thing that I have a really strong belief in, is that the ideas that I like to teach are ideas that are versatile, right? I want to work on subjects and kind of concepts that leave you as much possible, or as much as possible, kind of room to kind of grow and space to kind of improvise, right? If this idea of shadow being atmosphere and light being form was only applicable to one situation, I would certainly kind of devalue that a little bit. I think I prize it so much because I find that it is so applicable to so many different situations. And that is something that you can look at in terms of, you know, kind of evaluating concepts that you get from different sources. I'm sure that you know, all of you have seen, you know, more videos than mine, and you have studied with other instructors and worked in different workshops. But here I just want to give you the tool to consider, you know, what is it, or what does it mean to have a philosophy or an idea about drawing to work on, right? Is it necessary that you embrace one and kind of repudiate all others? Or is it more interesting that you evaluate each one situationally, right? And that you have the capacity to kind of pick and choose when it is most useful to you to kind of apply that idea. Now, of course, I'm priming you here to give me the answer that is, you should want to be versatile, and I've always found that for me that's the most useful. So Felipe, I don't know if I can pronounce the last name, Felipe Caliera, is commenting that he can't find the Cyril Pierce book, it's out of print. That much is very true. The Cyril Pierce book is out of print. If you're going to find it, I think that probably finding it on eBay is going to be the most likely situation. So it's also, by the way, like rather, it is not an inexpensive book. I think when I got my copy, it was maybe around $100. So if you're able to find it for less than that, that's great. If you find it at that price, that's pretty much a kind of fair market price for what it is. Now, the reason that I think Cyril Pierce's book is as interesting as it is because of how practical it is, which is to say that, like, I've read numerous kind of texts about composition, and I'll just talk about the Cyril Pierce one because I like it, not the other ones. But what I found with Pierce is that you can take either the whole thing, which is to say you can read the whole book and take it as one kind of unified thought, or you can kind of take it a little bit more a la carte. So you can read one chapter, but then that one chapter is immediately applicable to your practice. And that's what I liked about it so much, is that it was something that again, you didn't have to kind of take it in like a university course. You could just take a bit at a time, and you would still be getting like a great degree of kind of insight and value from it in that way. Of course, that does show a little bit my own penchant for reading books a bit at a time rather than kind of taking in the whole unified source. But nonetheless, I know that that's how most of us wind up practicing these things. if you're someone who reads the whole thing at a time and applies it all at once. By the way, you'll not be losing out with Cyril Pierce either. He does go into kind of great depth about the topics he discusses. So either way that you take it, I think that again you're in a very good spot working with Cyril Pierce. So I just want to move on to the rest of this comment here, and let's see. Very small patches in a given composition could remain nearly flat, whilst larger areas might receive considerable gradations. If this law is not obeyed, a small, over-gradated area robs the rest of the picture by monopolizing the attention of the spectator. That is, inconsistency has crept into the composition. Lack of unity has taken the place of general vitality. So that's the rest of the Cyril Pierce quote with respect to degrees of like unity versus variety in different areas. And it very much, like I said, is a principal feature in the formation of my own opinions about, certainly about composition and about how detail kind of relates to composition. You know, everything that we choose to do in a drawing is going to affect the outcome, and sometimes in ways that don't seem immediately evident. And I think this is the one. This is one of the things that I think it's a rather more advanced level of idea to work with, which is to say that some of us maybe are not thinking about how much detail. We're just trying to think, can I get the head to look human? Which is not a small task, by the way. There's a lot that goes into it. So just to say that while it might not be at the forefront of all of our thinking, it's a great idea to kind of like meditate on. Which also, by the way, is something that I say all the time, and maybe I should explain. So when I say that, like, these ideas, though many of them are like perfectly practical, a lot of them are also like kind of less actionable, right? And by that I mean, you know, shadow is atmosphere and light is form. I know I'm kind of harping on this one, but we'll just take it as an example. Shadow is atmosphere and light is form is both a practical solution, which is to say that like it's how we organize light versus shadow, but it's also something more than that. It can be used for something other than that. You can have, again, as Cyril Pierce notes here, you can have compositional ideas that also come out of that. How do we direct the viewer's eye around the canvas, or how do we suggest that the viewer kind of looks where we would like them to look, where we find the most interest? Well, how we arrange the light in our portrait is going to be a big part of that. And so if we arrange it with a philosophy in mind, then we can make something out of that. We can be in control of that. And this is where I mean that this is something that if you meditate on can be useful. That's not the first thing that you probably think about, or the first thing that you notice about the idea of shadow being atmosphere and light being form. But it's something that if you reflect upon when you're in the process of working, I think is a pretty rational, pretty logical conclusion to kind of come to. So when you take these advices, or when you take these ideas, when you read Cyril Pierce and you hear something like this, right? I think that it's very interesting to consider it on a few different levels. Consider its immediate practical application, but also, you know, consider in what other situations does this apply? In what other ways does this affect the outcome? And it's something that maybe as a student I feel like I might have had some inkling of this, though it wasn't really spelled out for me. Again, that these ideas are both very simple but very broad. I used to say that, or it was a line that I was kind of fond of, so I thought it sounded very clever, teaching at the academy, that we teach you effectively like the same 7 ideas, seven concepts for like 3 years. But it will probably take you like a lifetime to actually unpack the utility of these 7 ideas. Now, before you pin me down and ask me like, what are the 7 ideas? It's a number that is just an estimation. The reality is at the academy there are so many different levels to what we teach that you could say there are hundreds of ideas. But like the kind of core philosophies, the core ideas, right? Proportion, gesture, structure, value, things like this, those kind of remain the same throughout. And when we're talking about or teaching you about oil paint versus teaching about pencil drawing versus charcoal drawing, the materials and techniques involved can be very different. But materials and techniques are really just, I feel like they are kind of secondary, actually, which is to say that if you possess a profound understanding of these concepts, the materials that you're expressing them in could be anything, right? I remember being asked by a gallerist years ago, and this is like such a gallerist question, and as such, I was so like annoyed by it. But he asked, why is it you use so many different mediums? Because I would paint in gouache and draw in graphite or in charcoal and work in oil paint. I worked in all these different mediums, which for a gallerist is a pain. Because what they want is just a consistent IKEA product that they can show to their clients that makes you look like a very consistent product. It makes it easier to sell you. And of course, what I was doing was very much contrary to that. But the reason that I worked in all these different mediums was precisely because the rules in each one, though they remain the same, had to be bent and had to be kind of melded with the material itself to achieve a kind of outcome. And that kind of search, that kind of journey was so interesting to me. I would even say that nowadays it still is. I will still work in different mediums like watercolor and things, though it's a lot less now than I think it once was. I had my kind of years of searching for the medium that I preferred the most, and eventually it came down to, I love the control that I get working in graphite. There's this sense that with charcoal, though you can achieve like that same degree of control eventually, it's not the first thing that the material wants to do, and by that I mean like, actually that's something that probably I realized a lot when doing this, is that each material has its own like tendency. There are things that you kind of get for free when you're working in gouache that it would take you months to do in oil. I used to talk about like the idea of micro textures, which this is like going so far out in a digression. But suffice to say, like a micro texture, if you've ever worked in like gouache or in watercolor, if you look into a single kind of brush stroke, or you play with a brush stroke and you wet it after it's dried and you work on it, you get all of these little tiny like visual textures that take place on the surface of the watercolor. Those same micro textures, if you wanted to achieve them in oil, it would take you many different layers and different solvents and different kind of manipulations that almost just become disincentive to try to work that way in oil. But again, in gouache, it happens almost instantly. So for me, that like search was just a matter of figuring out there were these things that I loved, these things that I loved visually. How do I, like what medium do I choose that kind of best expresses them? And that's where it kind of becomes an interesting question for all of you, is considering like what it is about a painting or a drawing that you really love. And I know like that seems kind of redundant, like that you love it. Of course, you must know what it is. But until you really kind of put a name on it, I feel like it doesn't really become a part of your own process. And so like when you look at a Rembrandt, is it that it's his self-portrait? Do you love it because it's a Rembrandt self-portrait? Or do you love it because of the paint quality? I think most people, when they answer that question, eventually would wind up saying they love it because of the paint quality. And we love Rembrandt when he paints himself. We love Rembrandt when he paints the Night Watch. We love him when he does many different things, right? So sometimes it's not just about the subject matter. Now, there are other painters that you could look at and go, you know what? I love it just because of the subject matter. Fatin Latour, right? The famous still life painter, though he painted portraits as well. Point being, he painted a lot of still life, a lot of floral paintings. I think that part of what we love about Fatin Latour is that also we love flowers, there are so many artists right now whose career is tied to painting landscapes of the places where they live. And those landscapes are bought by people who also live there, who love the place where they're living. And so in that sense, right, like it may not be the paint quality that people love, but the place that they're representing. So just a useful question to consider, like, what is it about the artwork that you're really into? Felipe I'm probably pronouncing your last name wrong. Felipe Calhiera is asking, do things that using, let me see if I can, maybe there's some typos in this. Do you think that using graphite can lead you to paint more tight? I mean, it can be difficult to have a more loose approach to paint, like Sargent or Ramon Casas. No, I don't at all. I think that actually that is for me, that is only a correlation, not a causation. I have drawn in graphite and painted in oil and painted quite broadly, and done the alternative. I think that there is only, in that respect, to paint broadly or loosely, certainly there can be a small amount of habit in it, but in the end you're taking a conscious choice, and it's the choice that is either to give credit or to be the fault of how you're painting. So yeah, I mean, just in the same way that like I have drawn this in graphite, and also last month's portrait, which was very, very refined. Really, the technique was pushed up to a very high level. Those are both in graphite. So for me, yeah, the graphite is not responsible for necessarily how I draw. It's the philosophy and the idea kind of behind what you're doing or that you're working with that will cause it to be one way or another way. I know that also, like as a professional, perhaps I have more of that conscious control than I did when I was a student. I think maybe when I was a student, different, or things affected me in a different way. But even so, I still think that it's a little bit of a misleading conclusion to think that because you draw in graphite that it might make you paint more tight. In addition, I mean, like, the first way to change that would be consider your painting materials. There was the idea at the Florence Academy for the longest time was that you should be painting using only like very large brushes. So like, if we think about kind of brush sizes, I paint with like 2s and 4s, and maybe 6 is like some of the largest brushes I use. But if you painted with nothing under an 8, right, that is a way that you could definitely like change your paint application if you wanted to be more broad. And that was something that I think the teachers that I had at the academy were really into as an idea, was to try to make students paint a certain way by limiting the tools that they could use. And again, while that can have an effect, my feeling is it's a little bit of a shortcut in a way. It's a little bit of like giving someone a fish instead of teaching them to fish. Now, that's too broad a criticism, really. I mean, there's an extent to which painting with larger brushes, you start to understand the virtue of painting with larger brushes. But that being said, depending upon the student, I think that you could get a much longer lasting effect on their ability to kind of learn to paint more broadly by explaining to them why you should paint broadly rather than only changing the tools that you use. I hope that helps and answers your question. It's definitely a difficult one to answer though, because there's kind of so much in it. But I feel pretty confident that, again, it's about changing people's minds, not only changing their materials. So I'm coming just about to the end of the time that I have, at least today. I'll probably do another live stream sometime throughout the month and post those as soon as possible. I just want to mention for a third time, I am in the process of re-editing some of the August videos because of some sound quality issues. So if you are watching one of those videos and the sound is really awful, understand that is precisely something that I'm working on right now. But I do just want to say thanks to everybody for kind of showing up today, for asking questions. And if you